I had someone who had been incarcerated ask me if I heard about a story of Wild Bill at Central Prison cutting another inmate's head off, his cellmate. Well, actually, I do know the Wild Bill that he is talking about, and his actual name is Cardell Spalding. He was called Wild Bill. He was called Cardell, had different names, and there's a lot of legends going around about Bill Spalding, Cardell Spalding. I dealt with him many times while I worked at Central Prison, and I do know of the story as it relates to him allegedly removing someone's head. And I will tell you what I've heard, but then I'll tell you what really happened. I've heard that he had a issue with another inmate, and he was the head of a gang that was against his gang, some problems, and he ended up taking a shank, long shank, cutting his head off and throwing it down the stairs while they was walking down the hallway. I've also heard the story in which this person had shared that he actually had cut this guy's head off who was a roommate of his. And so there's several different versions of this. And the reality of it is that he did not cut an inmate's head. Now, he almost did. But the reality of it is that Cardell was locked up in segregation, and at the time what was referred to as long-term segregation, as well as this other inmate. And these guys, when they would be taken out on the yard for a rec, they would actually recreate together in a large yard. But as they went out, they would have to be strip searched, each one. And so what happened, this guy that he assaulted went out first. He was strip searched, let out on the yard. Cardell come out. He was strip searched. When they finished him, the person who was behind him waiting to come, move into where he was at to be searched, passed him a shank, and he went out on the yard. He took after this guy, and he cut him in the neck several times, and the guy bled to death, and he did partially sever his head. So it developed from that. It's sort of like, I caught a fish this big, then it's this big. And that's sort of how the story went. And the issue with it, Cardell, is that the guy had made a statement that he was going to get him. And so back in the days, hey, look, I'm going to get him before we get these. Now, this was in the 70s. Cardell, he was sentenced to second-degree murder in 1969 in the Central Prison. And then he ended up in prison. While he was in prison, he killed this guy. He got the death penalty for it, and it eventually was overturned, and he actually killed another guy while he was in prison as well, and got another life sentence for that. Now, Cardell, he was a very big guy, not real tall, but had a lot of muscles, big guy. He was very well respected, and understandably so. And he was not really a problem inmate. You would think someone such as this would be a problem inmate, but he was not. But Cardell was what we would call back in those days a convict. There was sort of a code as it relates to inmates back in those days, that if you caught them with something, then hey, you got me, that was it. And that's what happened when this happened, is that as soon as he did what he was going to do, he laid the shank down, he put his hands out to be restrained, they restrained him, and that was the end of it. And so that's the story of Cardell. But let me just tell you a little bit more about Cardell. My first dealings with him as an officer is that Cardell was in segregation. He was on long-term segregation then. This is in the let's see, this was in the late 90s, and During that time, the segregation blocks had 32 cells. It was divided up into two sides. You had 8 on top, 8 on bottom, so 16 on one side. And on that cell block, you would have a inmate janitor. The guys would be locked up, except during rec time. But when nobody was showering, no rec time was going on, the janitor had the privilege of being out on the block. He would clean up, clean the showers, sweep up, and it's sort of a privilege, a reward for them taking on that job. They're getting paid for it. But the big plus about back in those days is that you picked a very strong person for that position to control the block. And so if there was any problem, that person, hey, look, you either take care of it or you're going to lose your job. And they liked being out sitting in the day room. And what happened with me, my very first interaction as an officer, I went on the cell block. We took up canteen orders as officers. We would go to each cell and we would take canteen orders from the guys. We'd take the money, we'd write everything down, we'd go get their order, bring it back to them. And then we also would pay the guys their pay each day. And so, we had different issues that we would do. Well, on this particular day, I went on the block and I was taking up canteen orders, and I got to one particular guy's cell and I was having issues with him. And I mean, he was just cussing me up one side, down the other, had all kinds of problems with him. And I had dealt with Cardell even prior to this some, just interacting with him. And so this guy was giving me all up the creek, as the saying would go. And so when I finished with him, I got through with everybody as I was heading out the cell block. And Cardell was out in the day room when I was on the block. And so as I was heading out, he followed me up to the Sally Port, which is the exit. And he told me, he said, "Mr. Norris, you're a good officer. You won't have any more troubles when I get back." Oh, excuse me. "You won't have any more trouble when you get back." And so when I got back, that inmate was very apologetic. I didn't have any more issues with him anymore in the future. And I know what happened is Cardell went and had a conversation with him and let him know, hey, look, if you mess up my gig here, I'm going to take care of you. And so you didn't cross him. Everybody knew him. He had that reputation. As this guy who asked me about him, he had a reputation, and he even till this day, he passed away several years ago, and that reputation is still going around in prison today. So those are the kinds of guys that I've dealt with. He was never a problem. Yes, he wheeled and dealed, and he would try to do all kinds of different things to make extra money while he was in prison, and it was sort of a cat and mouse game that we played. But you couldn't blame him. We understood it as staff, and he understood that if he got caught, then he would suffer the consequences, and he wouldn't argue about it. And so those days, as I used to say, the inmates weren't the trouble. It was the staff when we had trouble with them. Those were the pain in the butt, some of the people you work with. Most inmates weren't the issue. And he was an example of, as I would say, an old school convict who his word was his word. You never had any issues out of him. He took care of it. You treated him fairly, and he would treat you fair. Until next time, have a great day. Hope you've enjoyed it. If you did, like and subscribe. Leave any comments below. Anything you want to share, stories, questions, and I'll be glad to answer those. Until next time, have a great day.